Hi, Capitalism listeners. As many of you, we are taking some time off to spend it with our families, even if in many cases over a screen, but still it's quality time with our families. So inspired by the recent elections, we decided to produce a very different podcast. Different because it's just Bethany and I discussing what we think about a topic, and two, because the topic itself is quite different. Economic podcasts don't talk about democracy, but I think democracy is very important, not just per se, but also for the functioning of the economic system. Our best wishes for the best possible 2021 after a very difficult 2020. We're looking forward to a fantastic 2021 together. Thank you. So, Bethany, are you familiar with the Silk Road?
Well, two different Silk Roads, right? There's the one a colleague of mine at Vanity Fair wrote a book about, the infamous one, but then there's the network of trade routes which connected China and Europe. So which Silk Road do you mean?
The infamous one.
Silk Road first launched in 2011 as an underground website where users could browse anonymously for drugs. It was Amazon.com with a black market bent.
So I have to confess I never used it. Did you?
No, I'm very boring. I don't do that stuff. But I read a lot about it, so I can tell you the fact that the founder was actually a libertarian follower of Rothbard.
Murray Rothbard, you mean, the sort of economic father of libertarianism?
Yeah, I will say that he's the father of anarcho-capitalism. But yes, his view was that for the market economy to work, the state was not only unnecessary, it was detrimental.
Now to that stunning arrest of the drug kingpin who goes by the name Dread Pirate Roberts appears to have cornered the internet drug market. His real name is Ross Ulbricht.
Okay, I could talk forever about Silk Road. I think it's a fascinating story, but I thought today we were going to talk about the relationship between capitalism and democracy.
Indeed, we are. What we want to discuss this episode, which is how capitalism and democracy relate to each other.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capitalism, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
So, I think unless you are an extremist anarcho-capitalist, you think that there is a role for the state to, at the very minimum, enforcing property right. Ulbricht thought that the Silk Road was a fantastic economic simulation that would let people see what was like to live in a world without the systemic use of force, because enforcement of property rights is generally enforced by the power of the state, and the power of the state is ultimately a monopoly. Famously, Max Weber said that what defines a state is the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. The problem started to arise when, because you have to actually deliver the drugs, the suppliers had a record of where the customers were living. That created a possibility of a blackmail. So at some point, Ulbricht was faced with a blackmail that if he didn't pay a certain amount of money, then immediately the list of all his clients will be published, and that will destroy his website.
What were his decisions? And what did he do?
What would you do, Bethany?
Well, I guess it would depend on how much I believed in a world without rules.
He actually tried to hire a contract killer on the web. As many more abstract philosopher, he wasn't particularly good at it, so he ended up hiring an FBI agent that sort of reported him. And so now he's in jail, and that is the end of it.
So you think that this is a referendum on the anarcho-capitalist dream?
No, it's a proof of concept rather than a referendum. I think it's clear you do need rules. Very often there is a perception that capitalism is just laissez-faire. And if you just reduce to zero any form of government intervention, naturally things will blossom in the perfect way. That's not true. At the very minimum, even most of the laissez-faire people say you should enforce the law. But then who enforces the law in the interest of whom? So we have seen recently, for example, when it comes to race, that the history in America is terrible on this front, as not being enforced in an impartial way.
And how do you get an impartial enforcer of rules? Because it seems to me that in a democratic system, the enforcers are always partial. That's almost a matter of definition.
You're absolutely right that there is a natural tendency to try to influence who the referee is. The way in which you made a system very difficult to alter is by bringing everybody as a referee. The reason why it's so hard to manipulate a Bitcoin is because the system of verification relies on everybody being a verifier. At some level, democracy is exactly that. If I can bring everybody to get involved, it's too expensive to bribe everybody. We get a system that, as Churchill was saying, maybe is terrible, but is better than everyone else that has been tried. I am fairly unique, I think, among economists, because I do believe that capitalists can only survive properly in a well-functioning democracy.
So it seems to me that that's the theory of democracy, but not the reality of it. Particularly, it seems to me, in a capitalist system where monetary rewards accrue to the victors.
You're absolutely right. Even within democracies, we have more or less imperfect democracies. So John Matsusaka just came out with a book called Let Them Rule, looking at the experience of referenda in the United States. That's the purest form of democracy, which is direct democracy. While even referenda can, of course, be influenced by money, I think it shows that they're influenced by vested interests less than the standard legislation. So it's a way to bypass a lot of the roadblocks that you have and have more the people rule. After all, the reason why in Florida the felons have been re-enfranchised is thanks to a referendum.
Florida was one of only a few states that banned felons from voting for life until 2018, when a majority of Floridians passed an initiative giving felons who had served their sentences the right to vote back.
If you had to wait for the Florida legislature, they were still upholding a law that was coming from the Jim Crow era that did not allow convicted fellows to vote even after they served their terms.
Right. So other than a referendum, how do you find this impartial referee that you need to make the system work?
So I think that it's very, very difficult to get impartiality, but the idea of bringing in disinterested voters, in the sense that not disinterested, they don't care, but disinterested because they don't have any strong vested interest one way or another, and so they're more likely to side with what is the right thing to do. I think that this principle pervades the American system. I think pervades, to a less extent, most of the Western democracies, and I think it's the right principle. Unfortunately, in the United States, we have drifted a lot from this original principle, but the idea, I think, is the valid one.
Yep. But isn't this aspect of democracy almost antithetical to capitalism, in that in capitalism, the rewards accrue to the owner of capital at the expense of the workers, and capitalism is sold to the highest bidder. And so isn't this in some ways the opposite of what a democracy strives to do?
Yes, but I think that that's exactly why they represent the perfect balance. You need a balancing act, a tension between a democratic system that tends to redistribute, taking away from the top and give it to the bottom, and a capitalist system that tends to reward disproportionately the people at the top. If you go too much in one direction, you have a populist system that does not reward enough enterprise and merits and so on and so forth. If you err too much in the opposite direction, you have a plutocracy that is extremely negative for a large fraction of the population. And my fear is that the pendulum has shifted too much in the direction of plutocracy in the last 20 years in the United States.
So capitalism taken to an extreme becomes undemocratic, and democracy taken to an extreme becomes uncapitalistic.
At the end of the day, capitalism is trying to distribute power. In a system that is regulated, that tends to be more state control, you have an enormous concentration of power. And I think that both in the economic system and in the political system, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so the way to save both our democracy and our vibrant economic system is to fight against concentration of power, in either of the two sectors.
So what do you think most often goes wrong? What are the capitalist forces that work against the ideal of democracy?
One is a very strong inequality. In a world in which you redistribute from a large set of relatively rich people, you are facing, in a democratic system, a lot of resistance. But if you have to redistribute only from a few, that's very, very tempting. And so as a result, if I am a super rich person, I start to build a system to protect me. And once I build that system, I not only protect my wealth, I also have a system that enhances my wealth. Take, for example, somebody like Carlos Slim, used to be one of the richest men on earth. He lost 30 billion one year simply as a result of deregulation in the telecommunication market in Mexico, because he made most of his money by having a very uncompetitive market and being the de facto monopolist in this non-competitive market. It's very hard if you are Carlos Slim and you are the richest man in Mexico and one of the richest in the world, not to use your power and influence to block that reform. And actually, that reform was only made possible through the pressure of the OECD. And then I'm told by my Mexican friends that after it was passed and had a very positive effect, they started to rolling back step after step under the pressure of Carlos Slim. And I had a former student who actually came to class and showed me a picture of the wedding of of the daughter of Carlos Slim. And the head of the telecommunication authority was singing and dancing in church. The fact that as a head of telecommunication, you are invited to the wedding of Carlos Slim's daughter and you go to that wedding is pretty scary to me.
That is a wonderful and terrifying story, and perhaps indicative of similar situations in the U.S., right? Where do you think we are in that trajectory where the people in power, those in charge of setting the rules and those who want to see the rules made in a certain way, are all sort of in it together, for lack of a better way of putting it?
Bethany, what is your view of U.S. democracy today?
I think we're at a point where the imbalance of money and power in the U.S. is threatening U.S. democracy. I think you can see it in a whole bunch of places. In the most obvious way, you can see it in the sheer amount of money that is thrown at elections. In a less obvious way, you can see it is the way lobbying forces distort decisions that come out of Washington. And I think in a way that has even more influence but is harder to see, you can see it just in the influence that the very wealthy and that big business have on the rules that are in place in our democracy. And you can even see it through charitable giving, which philanthropy in large part has become a reflection of the whims and wishes of the very wealthy. And those worlds are no longer in tension with each other. Philanthropy, I'm not sure, is really a countervailing force against capitalism at its worst. It sort of serves perhaps to quiet protest. And I'm influenced heavily by Anand G.R. Hardis's great book in this. But I think it's true. And so I think the forces of money and power are eating away at some of the foundations of democracy.
I think that the United States went through a gigantic swing. If you go back to the 70s, there was this very strong anti-business sense. There was price control, wage control, restrictions on capital movements, tax rates were extremely high, and so on and so forth. We have gone 180 degrees of change. Now we are in the opposite, in which the influence of the wealth in general, both in academia, in the world of the news, and in politics, is gigantic. I'm sure you have seen recently the hearings of the 4 big tech titans in front of Congress. There was so much power concentrated in those 4 guys that is pretty scary.
Yes, it is. Why do you think that change came about? And I think we are maybe starting to see a return in the pendulum, but it's interesting. My father and I were talking about this, in that when he was growing up and even his years as a young man, there was a respect for regulators. That was a job that you took on, and being a civil servant was something that was highly regarded. And now being a civil servant has almost become a door toward a job at a firm where you can then go on to make a great deal of money. I thought about that a lot during the financial crisis when we looked at the people who were in charge of enforcing the rules and setting the rules, and they were basically the same people as the big bank CEOs and the titans of the financial world. They had all somehow melded into one. And I thought about that also when I thought about how New York City changed. And New York in so many ways is a bellwether of the country. But New York City changed over the course from the 1970s to today, where there used to be uptown and downtown, and they were two separate worlds, right? The artists and the bankers didn't mix and match, and it became a world of oneness. And in some ways, maybe just like with capitalism and democracy, maybe you need a tension between the people who enforce the rules and the people who are subject to the rules.
I think is as often the case, the result of a lot of factors moving at the same time. But I think one big factor is the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall.
As long as this scar of a wall is permitted to stand, it is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind.
And the perception that capitalism has triumphed.
Thousands of East Germans came across the border today. Thousands and thousands came to look, even gape at this showcase of capitalism.
As long as there was a communist alternative, even the more pro-business side felt the need to, for example, be more understanding of the situation of workers and afraid to appear too much controlling the electoral process. Part of the natural balance in the United States is clearly the Republicans had been the more pro-business party. The Democrats, especially in the 70s, could easily be seen as an anti-business party. But there was a bit of a check and balance in place. Why? Because the Republicans were kind of embarrassed to be completely in the pocket of business because the Democrats could attack them. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall, they embrace business so much that they started to compete for the same funds. And so there wasn't a check and balance. There was a competition for who was getting more in bed with business to get the maximum amount of funding from business.
That's fascinating and points to a larger philosophical issue, I guess, which is the necessity of alternatives in life and the necessity of a certain kind of tension to keep the extremes in check.
I completely agree. And I think that actually ideology played a very big role in keeping people honest. And I grew up in a country that had the largest communist party in the West. For much of my early youth, the members of the Communist Party were incredibly honest, even when they took some local power position, et cetera, And part of it is because there's this very strong ideological element. And then once the ideological element collapsed, then was a race on who was getting more money. You can see this also in U.S. politics.
I was thinking when you were talking, it was fascinating about the fall of the Soviet Union, because I'm thinking back to some reporting I did for the last big book I co-authored, All the Devils Are Here, which was about the financial crisis. And there's a conversation I had that stuck in my mind, and it was with an old school Republican strategist and operative. And he said to me, in old school capitalism, there were just these guardrails on the sides of the road. You just didn't go there. And it wasn't that the laws told you not to go there. You just knew you didn't, because if you got out of line, somebody was going to discipline you. And there was this moral dimension to what could and couldn't be done. And I've wondered why that changed. And to me, some of the biggest marks of how that changed were obviously the subprime mortgage crisis, where people had no compunction about giving mortgages to people who couldn't pay them back as long as they could get theirs and get out of the way. And then I think about the game Valiant played and then copycat companies played with just raising drug prices as much as they possibly could without inventing anything new or creating anything. In other words, without even a cover of what it's supposed to mean to be a capitalist. And I was wondering how that moral dimension got lost. And I think your point about there being the existence of an alternative, whether it was the alternative as the old Democratic Party or the alternative as the Soviet Union, that maybe created that what seemed like a moral fabric more than any kind of moral fabric actually did. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, but I will add another couple of things. And one is the experience of World War II and even afterward of the Cold War created a sense of togetherness of a country. In a sense, you felt a loyalty to the country. By having a loyalty to the country, you had an obligation to the citizen of that country. And that was an important driving force. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, we all became internationalists. And so you don't even know which country you belong to. And certainly you have much more allegiance to people that think like you around the world than your next door neighbor or the person who cut the grass for you. And I think that that's where the cohesion started to fall apart.
So in an odd way, even though today we're almost taught that nationalism is a bad thing or a dangerous thing, in an odd way, perhaps you need a certain level of nationalism to ensure that both that capitalism stays within bounds and that democracy functions as we would like it to.
Yeah, in fact, there is an economist, Danny Roderick, that says that there is a trilemma, that you cannot have a nation state, deep economic integration, and democracy at the same time. If you have a nation state, you vote at the local level, and then this local level is not represented really when it comes to the international choices. So many international choices might be good for the world at large, but not for your little polity. And so either you don't let people vote, or you don't have an open economy. It's hard to have all the three at the same time. And I think that that's very true.
If where we've gotten to is that neither democracy nor capitalism are functioning as we would ideally like them to in the U.S., when you look at places around the world where there is capitalism without a democracy, what do you see? From China to Hungary, where you have an authoritarian government and a capitalist society. Are there any lessons there that you think apply to this conversation?
The risk, of course, is to have some form of plutocracy in one way or another. Hungary is probably going that direction, even if you have an appearance of some populist element. I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but the combination that goes under the name of fascism that was invented, I'm sorry to say, by Mussolini, is exactly in that direction, because as some of the appearances of a socialist politics, let's not forget that Mussolini was a socialist before he founded the fascist party. So as some element, and even the Nazis called National Socialism, because there's some element of socialism, but in fact is very much directed in terms of economic policy and interest by the interest of the large establishment. And this spring, we did at the Stigler Center a series of lectures that were quite interesting about the role that concentrated ownership, and in particular monopolies, play in the rise of fascist movement, including the rise of Hitler in Germany. There is definitely some effect there, is that if you are afraid for your wealth, having a repression regime that guarantees the protection of your wealth, at the end of the day, does not look too bad. Remember that Pinochet in Chile came after Allende was threatening the wealth of the Chilean elite. So I think that was clearly a cause and effect kind of relationship.
It's interesting. I'm in the early stages of The Third Reich, which is the best known book about Hitler's rise to power. It makes a fascinating point that Hitler also started with an appeal to the workers and a very socialistic policy. But as he started to get donations from big business in Germany, and often monopolies in Germany, and started to realize that that was the way to fill the campaign coffers, the rhetoric became increasingly empty. That was the basis of his rise to power, too.
Yeah, I think that my understanding of this series of lectures is not necessarily that the monopolists helping to get to power, but helping in consolidating power very fast after he got it, which is something we often forget. I don't think Hitler was necessarily inevitable. Even if you get somebody like Hitler in power, if you have a strong democracy, that should react and block his attempt to consolidate power. And I think in the Weimar Republic, this was not possible. And in part is because power is so concentrated. So the old American idea of checks and balance and fragmented power, both politically and economically, I think is very powerful here. And it is a form of protection of democracy. I think that we should not forget the American Revolution started not only as a revolt against the British, but also a revolt against the British monopolies. There was a very strong hate toward the monopoly position that perdured in American history.
It's interesting because both in the narrower lens of America and in the broader lens of this conversation around the globe, I think we've come back to that key idea of checks and balances, right? That's what makes a system work in the end. It works when capitalism is a check on democracy, and it works when democracy is a check on capitalism. And it works when there are broader forces keeping the worst tendencies of each in check. And when those checks and balances start to get eaten away is when we start to have problems.
Capital Isn't is a podcast from the University of Chicago Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review to Capital Isn't wherever you get your podcasts.